This is called the way of pragmatic coding. So, I don't think that websites should last for long. If something lasts a year, I think it was probably okay. If it lasts longer than that, you probably did a good job. But if it's at the point where everybody's dreading working on it, it's probably time to rip it down and start again. Now, sometimes even if preference doesn't necessitate taking something down, it might be a technology thing. For example, something like Flash might take a dive and all of a sudden you've got to redo some or all of your website. So I think that we just build the equivalent of sandcastles or ice sculptures at best. But I'm completely okay with that. Because our code, it just allows somebody or something to exist on the internet. It allows some sort of expression, whether it's commerce or news or social interaction. And I don't think that our code is or should be poetry. I think it's more purposeful than that. It's a solution to a problem. So I think that we should absolutely write the best code that we can, but we should write it that way because it helps us build things better and faster and more maintainably. And the final thing is, websites and the applications that we build on the web, they're always going to change. So we shouldn't worry about that. We should embrace it. We should expect that change and not dread it. The upshot of this is obviously what we do as front-end developers requires an awful lot of pragmatism. And just so we're all on the same page, this is the dictionary definition: dealing with things sensibly and realistically in a way that is based on practical rather than theoretical considerations. I think we need to be pragmatic about the way that we learn. I think we need to be pragmatic about the way that we build, and I think we need to be pragmatic about the way that we work with other people. Because as front-end developers, I think we have a fairly unique set of challenges. So this is a quote from a famous JavaScript gentleman called Douglas Crockford, and he said that the browser is the most hostile software development environment ever imagined. And that was a few years ago. And obviously, things aren't getting any easier now because we've got device and platform fragmentation, we've got different input devices, we've got touch, we've got mouse, keyboard, we've got games controllers. And on top of that, we've got widely differing bandwidth speeds, the way that people actually just connect to the internet as well. Plus, unless you are some superhuman being and you never sleep, the traditional approach to learning all of the necessary skills that we need to do these things inside and out is a pretty impossible task because there just isn't enough hours in the day to do it all. So front-end development isn't merely the mastery of one or two languages. It isn't even a clearly definable set of skills because you'll all know that what one employer wants and expects from a front-end developer is different than another. So to be successful as front-end developers, we need to be refining our capabilities constantly. We need to be able to judge and appraise new techniques and skills with speed. We need to analyse their usefulness and incorporate any benefits from new things straight into what we do. But before we can evaluate things, we need to actually have the knowledge and the confidence to know of all this stuff coming in, what is actually important and what isn't. So the crux of the problem is that the web, its nature, the capabilities, the very tools that we build it with are constantly mutating. And at the same time, we're all trying our best to understand and implement the latest and greatest tools and techniques to actually build the stuff with. And sometimes I think that can feel impossible. I know for me personally, feeling like that has bothered me for a long amount of time because I haven't known what the answer was. So what is the answer? It's Bruce Lee. It's funny, it's always the last place you look. So, Bruce Lee was an incredible martial artist, and towards the end of his tragically short life, what's interesting to us is that he moved away from these distinct dogmatic fighting styles, and instead he created something that he called Jeet Kune Do, which translated from the Cantonese, means the way of the intercepting fist. This is what he had to say from it. I believe this is from Black Belt magazine, but I'll let you all just have a read of that while I have a sip of water. We all okay? Okay, so in essence, he looked at what else was around him, what other fighting styles there were. He analysed what benefits they had specific to him, and where appropriate, he took those component parts and he plugged them into his own fighting style. So he invented this thing that was a fluid system. It was never stable. It was never finished. It was always constantly evolving. And I think that very same philosophy can be used in our quest to be better front-end developers. I think from the problem that I talked about before, I think we can feel more positive about what we do if we embrace the mindset that I'm calling the way of pragmatic coding, or to give it a Cantonese title, Pin Shen Do. I'm told that's right. A Chinese friend told me that. Might mean Ben is idiot. Pin Shen Do is nothing new. Be completely clear about that. It's probably what most of you do without even realising it. It's just a name. It's a label to pin on it. But I think it can be applied to both the learning of new skills, but also the manner in which we build things, and perhaps even the way that we interact with other people. So, you can tell I've been on the fortune cookies. There's a few of those, okay. I think that we can be more effective as front-end developers by mastering a couple of core skills and then seek out only component parts of others. So, I don't believe that we should make any effort to completely master other languages and skills, because it probably doesn't serve our purpose. I think we should take only what we need from other things, the little snippets of them, and incorporate them into what we do, and just disregard the rest. Because what's needed and what isn't is going to be individual to every one of us. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before you can get to that point, I think we need to intimately know a core skill, or skills. And those core skills will be like the base, the foundation on which we can go on to other things. Because I'm building this thing on the philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, and you've got to remember that Bruce Lee couldn't have got to Jeet Kune Do if he hadn't mastered the Chinese Kung Fu style of Wing Chun first. So, I don't believe that each of us can adopt our own personal style of Pin Shen Do without some base to mutate from. So, I'm not the sharpest tool in the box, so I started with the easiest. I started with HTML and CSS, but you guys might decide that JavaScript's your bag, or interactive graphics, or PHP, or Magento. It doesn't matter, it's going to be personal to you. It's your foundation, so you should start with whatever you gravitate towards, or whatever makes you the most money. But you should ensure that your core skills are absolutely sound before you attempt to build your own unique repertoire. I used to feel incredibly inadequate because I didn't know lots of different computer languages. But I think the reality of it is that there's perhaps only a handful of people on the planet that absolutely know back to front more than 5 or 6 languages. And I think they're the savants of our industry, and that's why we probably all know who they are. But for the rest of us, I think even aiming to know 3 languages absolutely inside out, perhaps even that's an unsurmountable task. And I think if you ever feel like that, when you're trying to take in loads of new information, I'd argue that perhaps it's not about your ability to learn those things, it's more about the breadth of the scope that you're attempting to take in one go. So, in that situation, I'd suggest to you, consider scaling back your aspirations, which it might feel like a negative thing, but I'm going to go on a big tangent now of why I think that potentially it's the right thing to do and bring you to the right result. 21st of October, 1805. Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson led the outnumbered British Navy against the Spanish Franco fleet in the Battle of Trafalgar just off the coast of Spain. It was a key moment in our great nation's history because if he'd have failed at that point, it would have meant certain invasion by Napoleon's amassed invasion force. Now, some things to understand about naval warfare before we go on. It usually consisted of one or two blows between ships. There was what was called the broadside, where two ships came against one another. They basically just lined up and thrashed each other back and forth with cannon fire. Perhaps worse than that was what was called raking, and that's a situation whereby one ship would very slowly manoeuvre itself across the front of another ship, and as it passed, it was able to fire cannon shot right down the length of the enemy vessel. At that whole time, you've got to remember that this ship is unable to return fire. Cannon shot would literally rip people apart. And even if a cannon shot didn't get you, there's a very real chance that one of the thousands of lumps of wood that was flying about the deck would provide for you. So it's hard and sickening to imagine the sort of carnage that those sort of people had to go through. Now, in battles of the time, it was usual for this thing of two boats to go opposite one another, back and forth at broadsides. It was a very drawn-out affair because of the speeds of the boats, and it was often very inconclusive for both parties. So it was bad enough you had to do it once, but then you had to turn the boats around and go at it again. But the genius of Nelson in the Battle of Trafalgar was his audacity, because what he did is he challenged that common notion, and instead what he did is he approached the French and the Spanish at a right angle in two columns. So, if you can see, here's the amassed Spanish and French fleet. Here's our boys going in there in two columns. So, for the entire approach towards the Spanish and the French, they're taking fire and unable to reciprocate. But once they get to the line, they're able to cut through the Johnny Foreigners in two parts at the flagships and round on them. And by doing that, they're able to rake them as they pass. So they're finding the flagships of the enemy in that bunch and going right around them and basically destroying the flagships first. So what that meant is, even though that they were outnumbered, they very quickly got rid of the big important baddies, and that meant that a lot of the other enemy ships just hung the flags up and basically said, "You're all right, mate, thanks, just having a drink." So it was an incredibly decisive method, but not without cost. Nelson himself was shot that day from the rigging of an enemy vessel that they got entangled with, the Redoubtable, I believe. An enemy sniper shot a musket ball through his chest, out of his back, and he bled to death on the Victory that day over the course of a few hours, but he did live long enough to know that he basically won the day and that we wouldn't be invaded. So, given what we just talked about, you're probably wondering why on earth I'm telling you this, and given the seriousness of that, it's a bit poor taste to bring you back to code, and I apologise. But let's scrub back in your minds to that image of the two sets of ships. When I'm faced with the enormity of all the stuff that I'm supposed to be taking in, all the languages I'm supposed to learn, tools that I'm supposed to be getting my head around, I like to do this. So, these things are going to be different for each of you. But in my mind, what I'm trying to do is think, out of all the stuff that I've got to learn, what is actually an enemy warship that's worth bothering worth bothering about? What's a flagship there? What thing can I cut off there that's going to make a big difference? Because the point is that you can essentially cut the head off the snake by doing that. And by dividing and conquering some key objectives, others will then become less important. So to bring it back to pragmatism, if the lion's share of what you do, if the lion's share of your income is in WordPress, make sure that you're spending your time thoroughly understanding the codex or learning PHP. If 90% of your work comes from Magento builds, don't start fanning around in Node. Do what's important to you, because that's going to be the base for your development. So be pragmatic and divide and conquer. Okay, so let's assume now that we're happy about how we're going to go about learning core skills. I think we still need some measure of knowing what our competency is like in what that we do. And then you think to yourself, well, how do I actually know if what I'm doing is good or not? How do I know if this is something suitable to show my mum? Well, I think there's actually a very simple metric that we can apply to gauge whether we are actually masters of what we do or not. So, before I hit you with the soundbite, I'd like to offer an analogy. I hope you're all familiar with the game Jenga. Well, just in case you're not,
there's one over there.
Here's an image to jog your memory. So, the game begins with the blocks stacked, and players take it in turn to remove one of the blocks out of the tower, hoping to retain the structural integrity as you go on. Okay, here's the soundbite. Competency with code is attained when the author can explain the purpose of each line. So, imagine that Jenga structure is a code base. When you see it in front of you, it's pretty easy at the beginning to make a fairly sound judgment of where you can pull a block out of that structure and keep things okay. You can easily reduce it one block at a time and be fairly confident things are going to be okay. But imagine playing Jenga blindfolded. I think that's what we're trying to do when we try and optimise, adapt, or improve code that we don't fully understand. Taking the analogy further, try building that tower up from nothing blindfolded, with just one hand. That's perhaps the situation when we try and build something with languages or techniques that we're not familiar with. So the takeaway is simple. Don't play Jenga blindfolded. When we understand the code that we write, we are its master, but when we don't, we end up being at its mercy. I think, as front-end developers, we should never grow attached to our existing tools and techniques, because they exist to serve our needs. There's always going to be something better in the future, and we should be ready to embrace it. And the choices that we make should not feel like some sort of holy war. So, personally, I've used Compass a lot in the past. But right now, where I'm at, my principal needs are making things like SVG image sprites, data URIs. I need fast and accurate prefixing of experimental CSS properties. And all those needs right now are better serviced by using something like Grunt or Gulp and the associated plugins. And so, cutting Compass out of my workflow is not something to be seen as negative, it's progress. And we should all feel like that. Not for me, for you. Chrome's another example. It's been my go-to browser for a few years, but I'm starting to find it a bit flaky. And I won't suffer any crisis about ditching it. As long as another browser can come along and offer me a more stable environment, give me the same or better sort of functionality, I won't think twice about ditching it. And I think that's as it should be for all of us. I think we should appraise and adapt new tools and techniques wherever a benefit presents itself, because to do otherwise, you're doing yourself a disservice. But to reiterate, these are my choices and my choices alone. When other people evangelise products and services that they use, by all means think about them and consider them, but apply them to your own context. So when tools or techniques get superseded, we should be absolutely ruthless about abandoning them for something better. This is my personal maxim on the matter. Okay. In Eastern martial arts, it's very common to bow. You do it all the time. You do it when you enter and leave the dojo, when you square up to a fellow practitioner, to your sensei, before and after a bout. And at first it can seem like the bowing thing is about subservience, but that's not the case at all. It's about showing respect to somebody, to a fellow practitioner, for example. So, if I'm basing this whole thing on the idea of Eastern martial arts as a philosophy, I think it's important to embrace all the positive aspects of Eastern martial arts, and I think that includes showing respect to others. So I don't know about you, but have you ever opened someone else's code, or you've been sent a design by somebody, and you think what you're all thinking now? And I know I have, and I think for the most part I've done that because I was an idiot. And the reason I was an idiot is because if you're working with somebody who's a fellow professional, and regardless of their discipline, the chances are that they can explain every single decision and choice that they've made in the same way that you can all explain the choices that you've made in your code. So often the features or implementations that you initially believed were flawed, extraneous or surplus are actually essential, ingenious and necessary. This extends to back-end developers. I don't think we should assume the worst. So for example, if you hand off code to back-end developers, and however many months later it comes back, and you think, what have they done that for? We all do it. Don't assume that the worst, because the chances are that they've had their own reasons for doing what they've done in not implementing the code as you'd originally written it. It's a brilliant quote, one of my favourite quotes on this. I need to get a plaque of it for me, from Nicholas Zakas. So instead of assuming that people are dumb, ignorant, and making mistakes, assume that they are smart, doing their best, and that you lack context. So, what can we do to ease this process between fellow people? Well, I think we can comment code as much as possible, because this is how we communicate what we intended to one another. And don't ever worry about writing too much code, because the worst that can happen is they'll delete it. But even if they don't read it, you probably will in 3 months' time when you come back to it and realise what you were actually trying to do with that piece of code that you can't remember writing. Fortune cookie. So, another thing, I think we should always offer fellow developers a handover of code. If we're moving code from one team to another, I think it shows good respect to offer to sit down with the person you're handing over that code to and take them through what you've done and why you've made the choices that you've made. And there's a very real possibility they won't give a monkeys, they won't be interested in that. And that's fine, but they might at the very least appreciate the fact that you've offered. There's also a very real likelihood that they'll never reciprocate the offer back to you. But we shouldn't expect it. We should do that because it's the right thing to do, not because we'll necessarily get anything in return, like Christmas. I always feel, for the most part, like I don't know what I'm doing. Phony when it comes to coding things, an imposter in my role. And I think I'll always feel that way, but I'm beginning to care less about the fact that I feel that way. And if you ever feel like that, here's a few points that I'd like to say to you. Don't assume that other people are doing things better than you. Even these big shot web celebs make the same mistakes that we all do. And that's not a dig at anybody, That's just the reality of this situation that you need to be aware of. We've all written Z index 9999 important at some point, and it still doesn't work. I loved Lego as a child, and whenever I got a new kit, I would always, I'd open it up, get all the bits out, and I'd make it exact to the instructions. But then once I'd done that, I would almost always, I'd break it all apart and start again, but that was the point where I'd then start to bring in other bits from other kits that I'd got, or just the big box of Lego that some relative had given me. Got Duplo in as well. Hands up who played Lego when they were young. Okay, so could you do me the honours and just make an estimate there of... In fact, keep your hands up, everybody who played with Lego, and then keep them up if you... I mean, you really played with Lego. You didn't just play with it once, you were a Lego fan. Okay, keep them there a moment. What percentage do you think that is, Simon, in the room?
99%, pretty much.
Okay.
Unfortunately. Didn't have a lot of training.
I was conservative. So I went for 80%. Darren Brown, my arse. The point is, you all think that you make choices in your life, but you really don't. You're here because your genetic makeup disposes you to what you do. You're here because you want to build stuff. You get a kick out of solving problems just like you did when you played with Lego. You wanted to make something that was greater than the sum of its parts. So, to wrap this thing up, don't compare yourself to other people, because it's not important what you build now compared to this person or another person. What's important is that because of who you are as a Lego builder, you'll be able to build bigger, better things in the future. And it's also my hope that you'll incorporate your own Pincendo of some sort, whatever that means to you. And then I'll leave the final words on the matter to Mr. Bruce Lee. Thank you for your time.